The first hard blizzard of the winter caught Susanna Dyer with 3 sticks of wood left, a cracked stove, a roof that leaked snow, and a 6-year-old boy, and by the second night she had burned the last of the wood and the better part of a chair, and was lying in the one bed with Toby wrapped tight against her, doing the sum every frontier widow does sooner or later in the dark, how long the two of them could last, and which of them would last the longer. Her husband had been a year dead, and he'd left her a hard-scrabble quarter section up in the cold hills above Coldwater. That had never been more than a hope, and Susanna had been too proud through the fault to tell a soul how thin things had gotten, had let the neighbors think she was managing, because asking felt like the last thing she had that was hers to keep. So no one knew she was down to nothing when the storm came early and hard and shut the hills under 4 feet of snow. No one but Daniel Tabor, who ranched the next place over, and who had got into the habit, since his own wife died, of looking out at his neighbors' chimneys of a cold morning, and who, on the 3rd morning of the blizzard, looked across the white and saw that the Dyer cabin had no smoke coming off it, and had not, he realized with a cold drop in his belly, for a day. He came on his big horse through snow to its chest, an hour's fight across a half-mile, because a chimney with no smoke in a blizzard means one of 2 things, and he could not sit in his warm house and not know which. He broke the frozen door in with his shoulder and found them in the bed, the widow and the boy, blue-lipped and slow, and very near the end of it, the cabin colder inside than out. And Daniel Tabor wrapped the 2 of them in every blanket he'd brought, and got them up on the horse, and took them home to his own fire, and it was a near thing, another night, the doctor said later, maybe not even that. When Susanna Dyer came back to herself, it was in a warm bed, in a warm house, with her son sleeping sound and color in his face beside her, and a big, quiet man feeding a good fire. And she understood she had been carried out of her own death and her boy's, and she wept from the shame and the relief both, and Daniel Tabor pretended not to notice, being that kind of man. She tried, the first day she could stand, to take herself and the boy back up to the cabin out of pure stubbornness and shame, and got as far as the door before Daniel said, mild as milk, that the cabin still had no wood and no roof to speak of, and 4 feet of snow on the trail, and that she was welcome to go freeze in it on principle if her pride required it, but that she'd be leaving her boy by his fire while she did, because he would not have a child die to spare a grown woman's feelings. It was said kindly, and it was unanswerable. And Susanna, who had spent a year refusing every hand held out to her, sat back down, beaten by plain sense and a warmth she'd half forgotten the feel of. She was not used to being cared for. It sat strangely on her, like a coat cut for somebody else, and it took her the better part of a month to stop flinching at it, and a good deal longer to stop waiting for the bill. The talk started before she was even well enough to sit up, for the hills above Coldwater were a small world, and a widow and her boy taken into a widower's house, Daniel Tabor's wife Mary not 2 years in the ground, and a young woman under his roof through the whole shut-in winter, was exactly the kind of thing the small world existed to chew on. Mrs. Wick was the first out, the moment the roads broke enough to allow it, full of concern about appearances, how it looked, a woman living there, the 2 of them and his children all snowed in together, the talk, the impropriety. Surely Susanna could be moved to town, to somebody's spare corner, anywhere more seemly than a widower's home. Daniel Tabor heard her out on his own porch, and then said the thing that settled it for good. Mrs. Wick, I pulled that woman and her boy out of a frozen bed 3 days back, both of them about an hour from dead, because nobody in these hills, including the good folk who are now so worried about how it looks, thought to go check on a proud widow's chimney. She's got no wood, no money, and no place that won't kill her before April. So she's stopping here, by my fire, where it's warm, until the spring and the thaw, and not 1 day sooner, and her boy with her. He said it leveled no heat in it, which made it land the harder. I've got room by the fire, and I've got plenty of wood, and there's a woman and a child who'd be dead without both. And I don't care who talks. You can tell Coldwater I said that, word for word. A man who let a widow freeze to save his own good name hasn't got a good name worth saving, and I'd sooner be talked about than be that man. Mrs. Wick went back to town with her message, and the hills talked, and Daniel Tabor went on not caring, and Susanna stayed. She earned her keep that winter the only way her pride would let her, which turned out to be the saving of them all. For Susanna Dyer was a quilter, a true one, the kind that comes along rare, who could take a basket of worn-out scraps and worthless ends and piece them into a thing of such warmth and such beauty that it stopped you in the doorway. And Daniel Tabor's house, since Mary died, had been a cold place in every way that wasn't the stove, a grieving man and 2 motherless children. Pete, who was 9 and gone hard and quiet, and little Nan, who was 6 and cried in the night, living in a house that had stopped being a home the day they buried their mother. Susanna could not give them back their mother, but she could do what she did, which was make warmth out of scraps, and so she set up her frame by the fire and quilted all that long winter. And the warmth she made was not only the kind you slept under, she made the children quilts first. And then, in the deep of the winter, she did the thing that broke Daniel Tabor open and remade him. She had found, looking for piecing scraps, a trunk in the loft, Mary's things, packed away by a husband who could neither look at them nor part with them, dresses and a shawl and a good wool cloak. 2 years folded in the dark, because Daniel hadn't the heart to use them, or the heart to give them off. And Susanna Dyer asked his leave gently, and when he gave it not quite understanding, she cut Mary's dresses, the blue one the children remembered her Sunday best, the green sprig she'd worn every day, the shawl, and she pieced them, over weeks, into 2 quilts, one for Pete and one for Nan, so that the motherless children could sleep every night of their lives wrapped in their own mother, warm under the very cloth she'd worn, her colors over them in the dark. And when she gave them, when she put into the arms of that hard, quiet boy and that crying little girl a quilt made of their mother's dresses, and they understood what it was, Pete, who had not cried since the funeral, put his face in his and sobbed, and Nan stopped crying in the nights after, because now her mother was over her while she slept, and Daniel Tabor went out to the coal barn and stood a long time, because the woman the town was busy calling a scandal had just given his grieving children back a piece of their mother that he, in 2 years, had only known how to lock in a trunk. "You made my children warm in a way I didn't know how to," he told her later by the fire when he could speak of it. "Mary's been gone 2 years, and I kept her in a box in the dark because I couldn't bear her gone or near. And you took her out and made her into something that'll keep my babies warm every winter of their lives." I don't. Susanna, I don't have the words for what that is. And Susanna, who understood grief from the inside, said only that scraps a person can't bear to look at are still warm, if someone who loves the owner is willing to do the cutting, and that Mary had clearly been worth loving to have left a house this full of the missing of her. And the two of them sat by the fire in the snow-locked house and grieved their dead together, which is its own kind of courting and warmer than most. The winter wore on, shut and white and long, and in the strange enforced closeness of a snow-locked house, the five of them became, without anyone deciding it, something very like a family. Susanna taught little Nan to set tiny stitches, and the girl took to trailing her like a duckling. She drew the hard, quiet Pete out the way she'd learned to draw out grief, not by asking, but by needing wood split, needing a boy tall enough for the high shelf, needing most of all someone to admire the quilts until the boy who'd gone silent at his mother's grave was talking again, gruff and pleased, by candle time. Toby and Nan ran the house like a small herd, and Pete appointed himself their captain. And Daniel Tabor, stamping in from the stock of an evening to a house that smelled of bread and rang with children and was warm clear to the corners for the first time in 2 years, would stand a moment in his own doorway as though he'd walked into the wrong house, a better one, and have to remind himself it was only for the winter. Only till the thaw, a thing he found himself remembering less and less willingly as the snow piled deeper. She told him her own grief by that fire. In time, the husband a year gone, a decent, hopeful man who'd worked himself near to death on hills that were never going to carry them, the long, proud, terrible autumn of pretending she was managing, because asking for help had felt like surrendering the last thing that was hers. Daniel understood the pride. He had a good deal of it himself. He took to drinking his coffee across the fire from her of an evening after the children slept, and they would talk low, the stock, the weather, the dead, and there was a thing growing in the warm, lamplit room that neither of them named. Partly out of grief's good manners, and partly because to name it would mean reckoning with the thaw, and what she would do after the thaw was the one subject the snow-locked house had silently agreed not to raise. So they did not raise it. They only sat nearer the same fire each week than the week before, and let the unspoken thing bank itself down like coals. By the time the roads opened, Susanna's quilts had become a quiet wonder. The doctor's wife saw the children's and had to have one, and then the whole county wanted them, and Susanna Dyer, the scandalous widow, was suddenly Susanna Dyer, whose quilts you waited a season for and paid dear, and she had money of her own again and a name for something good, and the talk should have died there. But Obadiah Stiles would not let it. Stiles was a deacon and a man of standing in cold water, lean and righteous and cold, the sort who has confused the sound of his own disapproval with the voice of God. And he had decided that the Tabor household was a standing sin against the morals of the county, and that it fell to him to cleanse it. He was not moved that the woman had been dying, nor that she'd made warmth for orphan children. Those were sentiment, and Obadiah Stiles dealt in rules. An unmarried woman had lived the winter in an unmarried man's house, and that was fornication's near neighbor, whatever the facts, and he meant to see it ended publicly. So Stiles brought it before a meeting of the church and the town's men, and moved that Susanna Dyer be named in her sin and put out of the county, and that Daniel Tabor be censured before the congregation, and he made his case in the cold rolling voice of a man certain of his own righteousness, about appearances and example and the slippery road and the protection of decent homes. Daniel Tabor stood up when Stiles was done. So did Susanna Dyer beside him, which Stiles had not expected. Deacon Stiles wants this woman put out of the county for the sin of not freezing to death politely, Daniel said. So let's all of us be clear on what happened, since he's left it out. The third morning of the December blizzard, I found Susanna Dyer and her 6-year-old boy Blue in a frozen bed with no fire and no wood and no food, an hour from dead. In hills full of good Christian neighbors who hadn't thought to look. I took them to my fire because the alternative was 2 graves come the thaw. She's lived in my house 5 months, and in that time she's made my motherless children warm in body and in heart, asked nothing, and turned worn-out rags into the finest quilts this county's ever seen. That's the sin Deacon Stiles wants her run out for. He turned to the room. I'll tell you all what I told Mrs. Wick in December and what I'll tell my Maker when it's time. A man who'd let a widow and a child freeze to keep his name clean has got no name worth keeping. I didn't care who talked then, and I don't now. If the price of doing the plain decent thing is Deacon Stiles' disapproval, I'll pay it gladly and count it cheap. And then Susanna Dyer spoke, because she had learned that winter that she was a person who could. "I'd be dead, Deacon," she said, quiet and clear. "Me and my Toby both, buried up in those hills, and you'd none of you have known till spring. Daniel Tabor is the only soul in this county who looked. You stand there worried about how it appeared that he saved us. I'll tell you how it appeared to me, lying in that warm bed alive with my boy alive beside me. It appeared like the only Christian act anybody in Coldwater managed all that hard December. You can put me out if the meeting votes it. But you'll be putting out the woman who'd have been a corpse if your town's care for appearances had been the thing that came looking for me. It wasn't. A man who didn't care about appearances came looking. That's the whole of it. The meeting did not vote her out. The meeting, in fact, having heard the actual shape of the thing for the first time, laid against Stiles's cold abstraction of it, turned hard the other way, for there is nothing a community likes less, once it sees clearly, than a righteous man who'd have preferred a frozen widow to an awkward arrangement, and Obadiah Stiles found his standing curdling in real time as the faces around him changed. He had meant to cast Susanna Dyer out, and instead had handed the county the plain heroic truth of her set against the plain cold truth of himself, and the comparison did not go his way. He left the meeting smaller than he came, and stayed small, because a town will forgive a great deal sooner than it will forgive being shown its own coldness in the shape of a frozen child it nearly allowed. Daniel Tabor married Susanna Dyer in the spring, when the thaw came and she was free to choose and not beholden, which he'd waited for on purpose. I told this whole county in December I didn't care who talked, he said on the porch, with the snow going off the hills, and I've spent the winter proving it, and I find I meant it more every week. But I waited to say this till the roads opened and you could go anywhere you pleased, back to your own place, to town, to a county where nobody knows a thing about us. So you'd know I'm not asking because we were snowed in together and it's easiest. I'm asking because you came into a cold, dead house and made it warm clear through, mine and the children's both, and I can't go back to the cold, and I don't want to learn how. Marry me, Susanna, not for the room by the fire. You've earned your own fire now, your own money, your own good name. You don't need mine. Marry me because I'd like the room by the fire to be yours by right and not by rescue, and because Pete and Nan have taken to saying their prayers for it, and because I stopped, somewhere under all those quilts, being able to picture the fire without you by it. He almost smiled. And I still don't care who talks. Only now I'd like the talk to be about a wedding. Susanna Dyer, who had lain down in a frozen cabin certain she and her boy were going to die unmissed, looked at the man who'd come through 4 feet of snow because her chimney had no smoke, and found the cold of that December was finally, fully gone out of her. "You came through a blizzard because you saw no smoke from my chimney," she said, when not another soul in these hills looked twice. "You gave us your fire, and you didn't care who talked, and then you let me cut your dead wife's dresses to warm your living children, which is the most trusting thing one grieving person ever did for another. I've been warm clear through since about that day, Daniel, and I've been afraid to call it what it was." She took his hands. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll quilt by that fire the rest of my life and warm your children and our children and the whole cold county if it'll buy them. And I'll be glad every single morning of a man who looked at a chimney with no smoke and didn't just look away. Yes, let them talk. Let them come to the wedding and talk. They married in the spring, and Susanna's quilts grew famous past 3 counties, and she trained Nan up to the frame as the girl grew, and she kept always on the foot of her own bed the first quilt she'd ever pieced in that house, not one of Mary's, but a plain, warm one of her own scraps, to remind herself, she said, that the warmest things in the world are most often made of what somebody else threw away as worthless, which she'd had cause to know from both ends. Pete and Nan slept under their mother's colors every winter of their childhood, and grew up knowing they'd had 2 mothers who'd loved them, one who bore them, and one who'd refused to let them sleep cold. And Daniel Tabor lived out a long, warm life by a fire he never once regretted sharing, and told anyone who'd listen that the best thing he ever did was ride toward a chimney with no smoke instead of away from it. And that was the story of Susanna Dyer, the widow who lay down to freeze in a forgotten cabin with her boy in her arms, and was carried out of the cold by a man who told the whole talking county he had room by his fire and did not care who knew it, and who found by that fire warmth enough to last her the rest of her days. If this one warmed you tonight, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I hope it found you well. I'll see you in the next one.